4 fallen angels found in a cave beneath the Euphrates River. Is this the sign of Jesus' return?
The inscription describes the moment when 2 teams of miners digging from opposite directions broke through the
Exact details haven't been revealed for unknown reasons, but it showed archaeologists made a remarkable discovery in a cave near the Dead Sea, Israel.
Embedded in the translated symbols were geographic coordinate hints. They matched the
Deafening mechanical noise. As he kept filming, the object slowly lifted upward. Even though you can't explain why, he tied a safety rope around his waist, giving...
Beneath the cracked riverbed of the Euphrates, where water has retreated as if pulled back by an unseen hand, something ancient has begun to surface, not as a ruin for tourists or a relic for museums, but as a discovery that refuses to stay buried. Because what was found there does not resemble a temple or a tomb, but a place of restraint sealed with intention, guarded by silence, and connected to warnings written long before our time, forcing an unsettling question to rise alongside the dust of the drying river. When Scripture spoke of things bound beneath the Euphrates, was it speaking of myth, or of a moment that was always meant to arrive when the world least expected it? And if you feel the weight of that question, stay with us, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe now, because what follows only grows more disturbing. The moment the waters of the Euphrates began to withdraw was not announced by sirens or proclamations, yet it carried a weight that felt unmistakable, because this was not the ordinary rise and fall of a seasonal river, but a retreat so deep and so sudden that it exposed layers of the riverbed no living generation had ever seen, as if history itself were being peeled back under the pressure of an unseen command. What lay beneath was not mud and stone alone, but a shape that should never have been there, a vault-like opening emerging from the cracked earth, with proportions too deliberate and symmetry too precise to be dismissed as coincidence, standing in stark contrast to the chaos of the surrounding terrain, and immediately unsettling those who witnessed it, because nature rarely builds with such intention. Local villagers, many of whom had lived alongside the Euphrates their entire lives, sensed instinctively that this discovery did not belong to the category of ordinary ruins or forgotten shelters, since the entrance bore no resemblance to erosion, collapse, or ancient flood damage, but instead looked sealed, preserved, and restrained, as though it had been waiting for a specific moment to be revealed rather than slowly uncovered by time. The air around the site felt heavy, not because of heat or dust, but because of the unspoken realization that this emergence was happening now, at a time when the world already feels unstable, divided, and strained beyond familiar limits, forcing a question that no one present could ignore, even if they wanted to. Why would something hidden beneath one of the Bible's most significant rivers surface at this precise moment in history? For those familiar with Scripture, the location alone carried a resonance impossible to overlook, because the Euphrates is not just another river mentioned in passing, but one named at the very dawn of biblical history, flowing out of Eden itself, as described in Genesis 2:14, marking boundaries, kingdoms, and epochs throughout the narrative of God's dealings with humanity. This river has witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the bloodshed of wars, and the fulfillment of prophecies, and now, as its waters recede, it seems to be revealing something that was never meant to be permanent, but only concealed until the time appointed. A phrase that echoes ominously when viewed through the lens of Scripture rather than geology. What makes this first sign so unsettling is not merely what was found, but the implication that the uncovering itself may be the message, a signal that something long restrained is beginning to surface as the world moves closer to a threshold it may not fully understand. If this finding beneath the Euphrates has made you reconsider the times we're living in, stay with this story, like the video, and follow the next developments. Crossing the threshold of the newly exposed entrance, the explorers quickly realized that whatever lay ahead had not been shaped by accident or softened by time, because the stone beneath their hands was cut with a level of accuracy that defied the chaos of its surroundings, forming a passage whose walls aligned too cleanly and whose angles held too steady to be explained by water, pressure, or erosion. As their lights traced the surface, it became clear that this tunnel had not been hollowed out by nature's slow patience, since there were no rounded edges, no signs of collapse, no sediment scars left by centuries of flowing currents, but instead smooth planes and deliberate contours that spoke of planning, purpose, and restraint, as if the river above had been allowed to pass harmlessly overhead, while something far older remained untouched below. The deeper they moved forward, the more unsettling the geometry became, because the tunnel did not twist or wander like natural caverns tend to do, nor did it widen into chambers meant for rest or refuge, but pressed onward in a straight, unwavering line that ignored the weight of the river above it, descending further beneath the earth, as though it had been designed to reach a destination that mattered more than safety or comfort. This was not a place meant for people to linger, nor a shelter intended to protect anyone from storms or enemies, but a route, intentional and uncompromising, carved not to invite entry, but to control movement, guiding whatever passed through it toward a point that had been decided long before modern eyes ever found it. With every step, the silence grew heavier, broken only by the sound of boots against stone, and that silence itself felt deliberate, as though the passage had swallowed noise over centuries, refusing to echo, refusing to give back even the smallest reassurance that the explorers were not alone. In that oppressive stillness, the words of Scripture began to echo with disturbing clarity. Because Luke 8:17 speaks of things hidden, not remaining concealed forever, of secrets brought into the light, not by chance, but by design, and standing inside a tunnel that had clearly been hidden rather than lost. That verse no longer felt metaphorical, but uncomfortably literal. The most terrifying realization did not come from what the tunnel was, but from what it was not, because nothing about its construction suggested worship, habitation, or burial, leaving only one remaining possibility that chilled everyone present, namely, that this passage existed to connect one sealed place to another, to ensure access when the time came, and to make escape impossible until that moment arrived. As the tunnel continued forward into darkness, one question pressed harder than the weight of the river above them. A question that refused to loosen its grip the deeper they went. If this passage was never meant to protect life, then what exactly was it meant to lead to? At the point where the tunnel finally surrendered its straight descent, the explorers were met not with openness or relief, but with resistance, because the stone before them formed a sealed chamber, whose presence felt abrupt and final, as though the passage had been allowed to exist only to deliver them to this exact boundary and no further. The walls were not merely thick, but excessive in their density, layered in a way that suggested containment rather than support. And unlike temples, tombs, or sanctuaries known from the ancient world, there were no carvings to honor a god, no markings to tell a story, and no symbols meant to be seen by human eyes, which immediately set this place apart from anything built for worship or remembrance. Light revealed surfaces that were aggressively plain, stripped of beauty and stripped of meaning, creating the unsettling impression that whoever designed this chamber had no interest in reverence, legacy, or ritual, but only in isolation and permanence. As they examined the space more closely, the absence became more disturbing than any presence could have been, because there were no traces of fire to suggest warmth, no ash to hint at sacrifice, no tools, no bedding, no offerings, and no signs that living beings were ever meant to dwell here in any ordinary sense. Even burial sites, meant for the dead, usually carry gestures of honor or preparation, yet this chamber rejected such human instincts entirely, leaving behind only stone, silence, and an atmosphere that pressed inward rather than opening outward. The air itself felt heavy, not stale but restrained, as though movement had been limited here for an unimaginably long time, and standing within those walls stirred a primal unease that went beyond fear of the unknown, and crossed into recognition of something deliberately suppressed. It was in that moment that Scripture echoed with disturbing precision, because Jude 1-6 speaks of beings who did not keep their proper domain and were therefore kept in chains of darkness, reserved rather than destroyed, restrained rather than erased, and the structure before them matched that description with uncomfortable accuracy. This chamber did not look abandoned by time, nor ruined by catastrophe, but preserved, as if its purpose had not expired, and its contents, whatever they once were or still might be, had not been released. The realization shifted the entire discovery from archaeology to warning, because prisons are not built unless there is something that must not roam free. What unsettled the explorers most was not the question of who constructed this place, but why it remained intact beneath centuries of flowing water, hidden yet untouched, waiting for the river itself to withdraw, as though the concealment had an expiration date. If this was a prison, it was not one humanity remembers building, and if it was something older still, then its silence may not signify emptiness, but restraint. Comment below and tell us what you believe this chamber truly represents, because whether this was a prison, a holding place, or something even more ancient, the implications only grow darker from here. When the chamber was finally illuminated in full, the silence fractured not with sound but with recognition, because standing at its center were four towering humanoid forms, whose presence felt less like discovery and more like intrusion, as though the light itself had crossed a boundary it was never meant to pass. Their bodies were intact in a way that defied decay, neither skeletal nor lifeless in the ordinary sense, yet unmistakably unmoving, preserved without rot, without collapse, and without the distortion time usually inflicts on flesh or stone, creating the disturbing impression that whatever state they were in had been intentionally sustained rather than abandoned. Each figure was restrained by structures that looked carved yet grown, binding limbs and torsos with rigid formations that resembled stone but carried an unnatural smoothness, as if the restraints were not merely placed upon them but shaped around them, adapting to their forms to ensure immobility rather than confinement by force. What intensified the unease was their arrangement, because these beings were not scattered or stacked like prisoners forgotten in haste, but positioned with precision, equidistant from one another, forming a deliberate symmetry that drew the eye inward toward an unseen center point. Their faces, though difficult to fully discern, were turned inward as well, suggesting not punishment but containment, not chaos but order, as if the chamber itself had been designed to hold them in a perpetual state of suspension, locked in a moment that never progressed. There were no chains clanking, no signs of struggle, and no evidence of resistance frozen mid-motion, which only deepened the terror, since restraint without struggle implies acceptance, exhaustion, or a power so absolute that resistance had long since ceased to matter. In that oppressive stillness, the weight of Scripture pressed in with chilling clarity, because Revelation speaks not vaguely, but specifically of four angels bound at the great river Euphrates, held back until an appointed hour, not destroyed, not judged, but restrained for a purpose that unfolds in time rather than immediacy. Standing before these four forms, aligned beneath the very river named in that passage, the coincidence became impossible to ignore, as geography, number, and condition converged with a precision that felt less like chance and more like convergence. This was not a mass grave, nor a display of conquest, but a holding place whose function depended on patience, suggesting that release was never meant to happen early, only when conditions above matched the moment decreed below. The most disturbing realization settled slowly, because prisons usually face outward, guarding against escape, while this arrangement faced inward, as though the greatest danger was not these beings breaking free, but something triggered when they no longer remained bound together. Why four, when history records countless fallen entities? And why here, beneath a river that scripture marks as a boundary between eras and empires, unless the location itself mattered as much as those it concealed? As the explorers stood frozen between awe and fear, one question eclipsed all others. Because if these were truly the four bound ones spoken of long ago, then their continued silence might not mean inactivity at all, but delay. And delay only exists when release is still part of the plan. What drew the explorers' attention next was not the towering forms themselves, but what rested at their feet. Because laid deliberately before each restrained entity was a sword, ancient in shape yet untouched by age, forming a second layer of symmetry that mirrored the four figures standing above them. There were exactly 4 blades, no more and no less, each still sealed within its sheath. And that detail alone unsettled everyone present, since weapons meant for honor are usually displayed openly, while those meant for use are rarely entombed in silence beneath layers of stone and water. The sheaths showed no cracking, no warping, and no trace of decay, while the blades within refused to reveal their substance, carrying a dull, light-absorbing surface that resisted identification, as though their composition did not belong neatly to any known category of metal or alloy catalogued by modern science. The absence of corrosion was perhaps the most alarming feature, because even relics preserved in dry tombs bear the scars of time. Yet these swords appeared suspended in a condition that ignored centuries entirely, neither rusted nor dulled, suggesting preservation not by environment, but by intention. Their placement did not resemble an offering laid before a king, nor a trophy left after conquest, but instead felt like a mechanism within a system, positioned close enough to be claimed, yet clearly separated from the bound figures by an unspoken rule. Nothing about their orientation invited touch, and nothing about their stillness suggested abandonment, creating the impression that these weapons were not forgotten but waiting, restrained just as deliberately as the beings behind them. Scripture adds an unsettling layer to this image, because the sword is repeatedly described not as a symbol of decoration, but as one of authority, division, and judgment, with Hebrews 4:12 describing it as living, active, and capable of piercing beyond the physical into the deepest boundaries of existence. Standing in that chamber, the explorers could not escape the sense that these blades were not tools of war in a human sense, but instruments bound to purpose, linked not to battlefields but to decrees, meant to be unsheathed only when restraint gave way to command. Their sealed state suggested delay rather than denial, implying that the authority they represented had not been revoked, only postponed. What made the scene unbearable was the realization that prisons rarely include weapons unless release is anticipated, because confinement without future action requires no armament. Yet here, beneath a river named in prophecy, every bound entity was paired with a blade, positioned in silent readiness. The swords did not dominate the chamber, yet their presence shifted its meaning entirely, transforming the space from a holding site into a threshold. If this detail catches your attention, pause for a moment and like the video now, because what these sealed swords imply about timing, authority, and what comes next only grows more unsettling as the discovery continues. What finally stripped away any lingering doubt that this chamber was meant to communicate rather than merely contain was the presence of a clay tablet set directly into the stone wall, positioned not like decoration or record, but like a warning, placed where no one could claim ignorance, its surface carved with deliberate precision despite the surrounding roughness of the chamber. The markings did not resemble cuneiform, hieroglyphs, or any known Semitic script, and even those familiar with obscure ancient writing systems found no point of reference, as if the language had been designed to survive recognition without ever submitting to full understanding. Portions of the inscription appeared fractured, not by damage but by design, allowing only fragments to be discerned. Phrases that surfaced again and again like echoes refusing to fade, speaking of the four who are bound, of their position beneath the great river, and of a restraint that would last until the appointed time. Words that carried no dates, no rulers, and no names that history could anchor. The absence of any chronological marker was perhaps the most disturbing feature, because ancient warnings usually announce eras, kings, or generations. Yet this tablet withheld all such anchors, forcing the reader to confront the message without the comfort of calculation or countdown. It did not explain how long the binding would last, nor did it justify why the imprisonment had taken place, but instead focused entirely on inevitability, suggesting that the event it pointed toward was fixed beyond negotiation, immune to delay or acceleration by human hands. The tablet felt less like a prophecy meant to be decoded, and more like a seal meant to be acknowledged, as though its purpose was not to inform curiosity, but to testify that restraint itself had an expiration. This aligns chillingly with Scripture's insistence that timing is withheld by design, because Matthew 24-36 makes clear that knowledge of the moment belongs to God alone, stripping humanity of the illusion that signs exist to satisfy prediction rather than readiness. Standing before the tablet, the explorers reportedly felt that the message was not speaking to ancient readers at all, but to those who would encounter it at the precise moment when the river withdrew and the prison was no longer hidden, implying that revelation does not arrive early nor late, but only when concealment is no longer required. The tablet did not answer questions. It rearranged them, shifting focus away from when release would occur and toward the reality that release had always been intended. The descent back through the tunnel did not feel like retreat, because the air itself seemed to tighten, as though the passage had become aware of intrusion. And it was there, in the narrowest stretch where stone pressed close and sound carried too far. That movement shattered the silence. From the pale dust ahead, something unfolded rather than appeared, its surface reflecting the explorer's lights with a dull, bone-like whiteness, revealing a form that did not move, according to any familiar anatomy. Limbs branched where they should not have, bending and rebending with insect-like precision, while clusters of eyes caught the light at different angles, tracking motion faster than the human mind could follow. Its mouth opened not in a roar, but in a silent display of elongated fangs, layered and narrow, as though designed for grasping rather than tearing, and in that instant, hesitation vanished. The creature did not test the space or circle its intruders, because it surged forward with unnatural acceleration. Closing distance in a tunnel too tight for escape, its many limbs scraping against stone, in a rhythm that sounded almost mechanical. Panic fractured coordination. Voices overlapped, and equipment slammed into rock as the cameras shook violently, struggling to hold focus while the thing advanced with deliberate certainty. There was no curiosity in its movement and no hesitation in its charge, creating the overwhelming impression that this encounter was neither accidental nor defensive, but triggered by proximity alone, as though the tunnel itself had thresholds that once crossed demanded response. Moments before the feed collapsed, the last frames captured a blur of white limbs and reflecting eyes filling the passage entirely, erasing depth and direction until signal loss swallowed the image without warning. The footage did not end with impact or sound of struggle, but with abrupt absence, leaving behind only fragmented audio and a sense that whatever had emerged was never meant to be documented, only experienced briefly as proof. Survivors later described the encounter not as an attack in the animal sense, but as an enforcement, an action taken to restore separation between what was bound and those who came too close to understanding it. Scripture casts a heavy shadow over that moment, because Ephesians 6:12 warns that the struggle humanity faces is not against flesh and blood, but against powers and authorities that operate beyond the visible, and nothing about the creature suggested biology as its primary definition. It did not behave like a predator defending territory, nor like a beast startled by light, but like a mechanism activated by violation, raising the question of whether it served as a guardian placed to prevent release, or a warning designed to announce that the boundary had already been crossed. If this encounter felt driven by intention rather than instinct, share your thoughts in the comments, because whether it was a guardian enforcing restraint or a warning of escalation may reveal how close the world is to the moment Scripture says has been appointed. While the team inside the passage struggled with darkness and distance, events above the river unfolded with an eerie synchronization that no one present could later explain away as coincidence, because witnesses along the banks described the sky changing first, not with thunder or wind, but with a sudden dimming that made afternoon feel like dusk. From within that muted light, a massive object descended slowly, its shape unmistakable even at a distance, forming a rigid, diamond-like silhouette that appeared too precise to be cloud, drone, or aircraft, hovering without sound, as though gravity itself had loosened its grip. Those watching reported a pressure in the air rather than noise, a sensation that made breathing feel shallow, while the object remained suspended directly above the Euphrates before reversing direction and ascending back into the clouds with the same controlled stillness, leaving behind no vapor trail, no sonic echo, and no explanation. Almost immediately, the river responded, or seemed to, as fish began surfacing along the banks in unnatural numbers, floating lifeless against the slow current, while birds abandoned nests mid-flight, scattering from the area without the warning calls that usually accompany danger. Herd animals broke from grazing patterns and fled across open ground as if driven by something unseen, refusing to return even hours later. And local residents spoke of an instinctive dread that preceded awareness, as though the environment itself had sensed intrusion before human observers could name it. The timing of these reactions was precise enough to unsettle even the most skeptical, because they unfolded simultaneously rather than sequentially, suggesting not a chain of cause and effect, but a single trigger reverberating through land, water, and sky. Authorities moved quickly after these reports spread, sealing off the area under vague explanations and restricting access without public clarification, while recordings taken by witnesses began disappearing from online platforms, leaving behind only fragments and testimony that pointed towards something far larger than an isolated incident. Scripture looms heavily over this convergence, because Luke 21:11 speaks not of signs confined to one realm, but of disturbances that manifest above and below, in the heavens and on the earth, a pairing that feels disturbingly literal. When the sky descends, as the river reacts, and creation itself appears to recoil. What makes these signs impossible to dismiss is not their spectacle alone, but their alignment. Because ancient warnings rarely describe isolated wonders, instead emphasizing moments when multiple domains respond together as though acknowledging a shift already in motion. If what rose from the clouds and what stirred beneath the river were connected, then the sealing of the site may not mark an ending, but an intermission, a pause, before consequences ripple outward beyond control or containment. Stay alert and subscribe now. Because if these were only the first signs above and below, what follows may not remain hidden long enough for the world to look away. The question that now hangs over every detail of this discovery is not framed by calendars or predictions, because Scripture consistently pulls attention away from dates and redirects it toward discernment, urging watchers to recognize patterns rather than calculate endings. From the receding river to what surfaced beneath it, from the restraint hidden below ground to the disturbances that rippled through sky and creation, nothing about these events demands a declaration that the end has arrived. Yet everything about them insists that something has begun to move. Luke 21:28 does not instruct fear or speculation, but awareness, calling those who witness such convergence to look up, not because the moment is known, but because recognition itself is a test of readiness rather than knowledge. What makes this moment unsettling is not the scale of what was uncovered, but the timing of revelation. Because things bound beneath the surface for generations do not emerge without reason, and signs that appear across land, water, and sky rarely serve as spectacle alone. Scripture does not describe the return of Christ as an ambush for the attentive, but as a moment preceded by warnings clear enough to be noticed by those willing to see, and subtle enough to be dismissed by those who prefer comfort. The unveiling of what was hidden does not announce finality. It exposes posture, revealing whether attention is fixed on routine or anchored in vigilance. Matthew 24-42 frames watchfulness not as anxiety, but as responsibility, emphasizing that readiness is cultivated long before the hour arrives, and that awareness itself is the dividing line between those caught unaware and those who recognize significance without panic. In that light, this discovery does not function as a trumpet blast, declaring conclusion, but as a quiet disturbance meant to awaken conscience, pressing the question inward rather than outward. Are we prepared not because we know what comes next, but because we understand that moments of revelation are never isolated, and that history often shifts before humanity agrees on what it has witnessed? What was concealed beneath the Euphrates did not remain hidden forever, and what surfaced did so alongside signs that refused to remain confined to a single explanation, suggesting that exposure itself may be the message. This is not an announcement of the end, but a call to awareness, a reminder that Scripture's warnings were never meant to satisfy curiosity, but to sharpen attention. If this reflection stirred something deeper than fascination, like the video, share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe, because this story has not reached its conclusion, and what follows may demand far more than passive observation. Thank you for watching.